Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The geometry of a hansom cab, the winter of 1895, remains etched in my memory as a period of particularly stifling atmospheric gloom. For 3 days, a dense, soot-stained fog, the variety the Londoners colloquially term a pea-souper, had descended upon the metropolis. It drifted through the arterial streets of Marylebone, blurring the gas lamps into sickly amber smudges and muffling the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon the cobblestones. Inside our quarters at 221B Baker Street, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of our sitting room. The air was thick with the acrid scent of Holmes' stronger tobacco and the chemical pungency of some experiment involving copper sulfates that he had been simmering over a spirit lamp since dawn. I sat by the hearth, attempting to lose myself in a recent British medical journal, though my eyes frequently strayed to my companion. Sherlock Holmes was in one of his grey moods. He had not had a case of any intellectual merit for a fortnight, and the inactivity was eating at his spirit like an acid. He spent the morning pacing the perimeter of the room with the silent, predatory grace of a caged panther, his hawk-like features sharpened by a restless energy. "You have been to the Strand this morning, I see, Watson," he remarked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. He had stopped his pacing and was staring intently at the toe of my left boot. I looked down, surprised. "I have not left the house since breakfast, Holmes. The fog is far too treacherous for a man with a weakened Jezal bullet wound in his leg." Holmes offered a thin, wintry smile. "And yet the evidence suggests otherwise. Or rather, it suggests that the Strand has come to you. You were standing by the window when the postman arrived, were you not? And you leaned out to hail a passing hansom for Mrs. Hudson's sister earlier." "I did. But how the splash of mud upon your left instep," he said, gesturing with a long, nicotine-stained finger. "It is a peculiar shade of reddish ochre. It is the specific composition of the grit used for the recent excavations near St. Clement Danes. It is quite distinct from the greyish clay of Baker Street. A passing cab must have been driven with some vigour through a puddle of it, and you, my dear Watson, were the unfortunate recipient of its spray while you leaned over the sill." I laughed, shaking my head. "It is absurdly simple when you explain it. It is always simple, Watson, once the observer knows what to look for. But simplicity is a dull companion. I crave the complex, the bizarre." He broke off as a sudden, frantic drumming sounded on the door downstairs. It was not the measured knock of a visitor, but the desperate pounding of someone in the grip of a great agitation. A moment later, we heard the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Hudson, followed by a heavy, stumbling ascent up our stairs. The door burst open, and a man staggered into the room. He was tall, dressed in the expensive but now dishevelled furs of a gentleman, but his face was the colour of curdled milk. He clutched the back of a chair for support, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, his voice cracking, "you must come. It is the impossible. The fog, it has given up a ghost, and the ghost has committed a murder." Holmes stood perfectly still, his eyes suddenly igniting with that piercing, analytical light I knew so well. He reached for his dressing gown, casting it aside in favour of his tweed frock-coat. "Pray, compose yourself, sir," Holmes said, his voice now crisp and commanding. "You are Mr. Silas Vane, the private secretary to Lord Belfort, if I am not mistaken. I recognise the crest on your signet ring. Take a seat, take a breath. And tell us why a ghost requires a lantern to commit a crime in the middle of a London square." The man gasped, staring at Holmes in terror. How did you know about the lantern?" "Because," Holmes replied, pointing to the man's sleeve, "you have a streak of whale oil soot on your cuff that could only come from the venting of a standard-issue railway or nautical lantern, and yet you are dressed for a gala. Now, the facts, Mr. Vane. Give us the facts." Chapter 2. The tragedy of the locked garden. I rose quickly to administer a restorative glass of brandy to our visitor, whose pallor had reached a truly alarming intensity. Silas Vane drained the spirit in a single convulsive gulp, the glass chattering against his teeth. He sank into the velvet-lined armchair, his breath beginning to level out, though his eyes remained fixed on Holmes with a mixture of reverence and primal dread. "Now, Mr. Vane," Holmes said, leaning back and joining his fingertips into a steeplier posture I knew signified his total immersion in a problem. "We have the atmosphere, a fog-choked night and a spectral lantern. Let us have the geography. Where did this impossible event occur?" "Berkeley Square, Mr. Holmes," Vane replied, his voice a low tremor. "Specifically within the Belfort enclosure, the private, wrought-iron gated garden that sits at the square's centre. As you likely know, Lord Belfort's townhouse overlooks the eastern side. Access to the garden is strictly limited to the residents who possess a key. The railings are 7 feet high, topped with formidable iron spikes." "A locked room mystery, transposed to the outdoors," Holmes murmured, his eyes half closed. "Continue." "Last night, Lord Belfort hosted a small, rather sombre dinner party. Among the guests was his nephew and heir, the Honourable Philip Stanhope. Philip was a man of, shall we say, spirited temperament. He and his lordship had been engaged in a heated debate regarding the sale of the family's Norfolk estates. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Philip, claiming he needed the bracing air to clear his head, took the garden key and stepped out into the fog. "And he did not return?" I asked. "Not alive, Dr. Watson. About 20 minutes later, I was standing on the balcony of the library, hoping to see if he was returning so I might mediate between him and his uncle. The fog was a wall of grey wool, but suddenly I saw a light, a dim, flickering yellow glow moving slowly through the very centre of the garden. "The lantern," Holmes interjected. "Yes, but here is the horror of it, Mr. Holmes. The light did not bob or sway as it would in a man's hand. It glided. It moved with a smooth, sickening uniformity, passing directly through the dense thicket of rhododendrons where no human could possibly walk without the sound of breaking branches. I heard no footsteps. I heard only a single, stifled crier sound of such profound terror that it haunts me still. Then the light simply vanished." Vane wiped a fresh bead of sweat from his brow. I summoned the footman. We took lanterns of our own and unlocked the south gate. We found him in the centre of the lawn, near the sundial. Philip was dead. His face was twisted into a mask of such utter horror that one of the servants fainted at the sight. And beside him, resting on the grass as if it had been placed there by a gentleman's valet, was that wretched maritime lantern. Holmes sharpened his gaze. "And the ground?" "I recall it rained heavily on Tuesday. The turf must be soft." "Exactly, sir," Vane cried, leaning forward. "That is the impossibility. The grass was slick with dew and damp earth. Philip's own footprints were clearly visible, leading from the gate to the sundial. But there were no other marks, no footprints of an assailant, no trail left by the ghost with the lantern. The perimeter railings were locked, and the watchman at the square's entrance swears no one entered or left. Philip Stanhope was alone in a locked garden, yet he was frightened to death by a light that left no trace of a bearer." Holmes rose abruptly and began to shrug into his heavy Inverness cape. "A most refreshing problem, Watson. The elements are delightfully contradictory. We have a victim killed by ghostly means, yet the ghost is considerate enough to leave behind a very tangible, soot-stained whale oil lantern. If spirits have begun to utilize 18th century nautical technology, the afterlife has become far more industrial than the theologians lead us to believe." "You think it was murder, then?" Vane asked, hope flickering in his eyes. "I never think until I have the data, Mr. Vane. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has evidence. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. But I will say this. Dead men do not carry lanterns, and ghosts do not burn whale oil." He turned to me, his eyes dancing with the fire of the chase. "Watson, if you could be so good as to bring your service revolver. The fog is thick, and while our opponent may not be a ghost, they are certainly resourceful. We shall see what the Belfort enclosure has to tell us." As we descended the stairs into the biting chill of the street, the fog seemed to press against the windows of the hansom cab like a living thing. Holmes sat in silence, his chin sunk upon his chest, already lost in the labyrinth of his own deductions. I, however, could not shake the image of a man dying of fright in a locked garden while a silent light glided through the thorns. Chapter 3. the silent testimony of the turf, the transition from the relative warmth of our hansom to the biting, damp reality of Berkeley Square was like stepping into a vat of ice water. The fog here seemed even more purposeful, swirling in thick, yellowish eddies around the base of the towering plane trees that lined the square. The Belfort enclosure loomed before USA dark, rectangular void of greenery, hemmed in by the jagged silhouettes of Victorian ironwork. At the south gate, a solitary constable stood shivering, his cape glistening with moisture. Beside him stood a small, wiry man in a bowler hat, his sharp features pinched by the cold. It was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard.
"Ah, Holmes!"
Lestrade exclaimed, his voice muffled by a wool muffler. "I might have guessed this business would draw you out. A bit more theatrical than your usual fare, isn't it? Spectral lights and men frightened to death in locked gardens. The theatre, Lestrade, is often the mask worn by a very calculating reality," Holmes replied, his eyes already scanning the lock on the gate. "Has the scene been disturbed?" "Only by the doctor who pronounced him, and the stretcher-bearers who moved the body to the gardener's shed just there." Lestrade pointed to a small stone structure near the gate, "but we were careful. We followed your old step-lightly rule. The grass is as we found it, though I'll be hanged if it tells us anything other than the fact that Stanhope walked to his death alone." Holmes ignored the sarcasm, taking a lantern from the constable and stepping into the garden. Vane, Watson, and I followed in a grim procession. The garden was a masterpiece of Victorian landscaping, even in its winter desolation. Gravel paths curved around manicured beds, but the centre was a wide, flat expanse of lawn dominated by an ancient stone sundial. Holmes dropped to his knees several yards before the sundial. He moved with a slow, agonizing precision, his lantern held inches from the blades of grass. I watched, fascinated, as he traced the path of the deceased. "The Honourable Philip Stanhope had a heavy tread," Holmes remarked, his voice echoing in the stillness. "He favoured his right side slightly, a result, perhaps, of a sporting injury. The impressions are deep, the mud pushed forward by the toe. He was walking with purpose, perhaps even anger, until he reached this point, 10 feet from the dial. He moved the light forward. Here, the character of the footprints changes, the stride shortens, the heels are dug in." He stopped. He turned. He retreated 2 steps, then pivoted again. "Fear, Watson. Clear, unmistakable physiological fear captured in the loam." I looked at the grass. To my eyes, it was merely a bruised mess of green and brown. "But Holmes, look at the surrounding area. It's pristine. If someone approached him, surely they would have left a mark." "That is the singularity of the matter," Lestrade interrupted, joining us. "Search as we might, there isn't so much as a blade of grass out of place around him. And look at the rhododendrons Vane mentioned." He pointed to a dense, waist-high thicket of dark leaves 20 feet away. "Vane says he saw the light pass through them. We've examined the branches. Not a twig is snapped. No leaves are torn. If a man carrying a lantern walked through there, he did it by turning into mist." Holmes rose and walked toward the rhododendrons. Instead of looking at the bushes, however, he turned his attention to the stone sundial. It was a heavy, moss-covered pillar of granite. He ran his hand over the flat bronze plate of the dial, then peered closely at the base where the stone met the earth. "A maritime lantern, you said?" "Mr. Vane?" Holmes asked, without looking back. "Yes, sir. It's in the shed with the body." Holmes strode to the shed. Inside, under the flickering light of a single candle, lay the mortal remains of Philip Stanhope. His face was indeed a harrowing sight, the eyes wide and staring, the mouth locked in a silent scream of terminal terror. But Holmes was interested in the object on the workbench. It was a sturdy lantern of brass and glass, heavy and functional. Holmes picked it up, sniffing the venting holes at the top. He then took a small magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the base of the lantern. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said, his eyes narrowed. "Did you notice the smell of the garden?" Lestrade sniffed the air. Fog, soot, and damp earth. The usual London bouquet. Nothing else? No faint, lingering scent of, perhaps, scorched ozone, or perhaps something more organic. Holmes picked up a tiny, almost invisible fragment of something from the lantern's handle with a pair of tweezers. He held it up to the light. It looked like a single, translucent thread, no longer than a fingernail. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "A thread, Watson. A very specific, high-tensile thread of silver-grey silk, but not from any tailor in Savile Row. And look here, on the glass of the lantern." He pointed to a faint, circular smudge on the inner side of the glass. "The soot is uneven. It has been wiped, but not by a cloth. By something soft, moist, and ribbed." He turned to Vane, who was looking more unsettled than ever. "Mr. Vane, you mentioned the light glided through the bushes. Did it maintain a constant height from the ground?" Vane hesitated. I believe so. About 4 feet up. It didn't bounce at all. It was like a star floating through the mist." Holmes' face broke into a grim mask of satisfaction. "Lestrade, I believe you can let your men go home. The ghost will not be returning tonight. It has already achieved its purpose. Watson, we must return to Baker Street. I have a sudden urge to consult my monographs on the migratory patterns of the North Atlantic and the tension strength of specialized pulleys." "Pulleys?" Lestrade scoffed. "In a garden with no trees high enough to rig them." "Precisely," Holmes snapped, his eyes flashing. "Which makes the mechanism all the more elegant. Come, Watson, the fog is lifting, and the truth is beginning to solidify." Chapter 4. The shadows of the air apparent the following morning, the fog had surrendered to a crisp, biting frost that turned the London streets into a landscape of silver and glass. Despite the late hour of our return from Berkeley Square, Holmes was up before the sun, his dressing gown wrapped tightly around his lean frame as he pored over a stack of shipping gazettes and genealogical records. "The Belfort line, Watson, is as twisted as an ancient briar," he remarked, tossing a heavy, leather-bound volume onto the breakfast table. "Lord Belfort is the 11th of his name. He is a man of vast wealth but dwindling liquidity. The Norfolk estates, which Philip Stanhope so vehemently protected, are the crown jewels of the family holdings. With Philip out of the way, the path to their liquidation is considerably smoother." "You suspect the uncle?" I asked, pouring a cup of tea. "In a mystery of this nature, Watson, one must suspect everyone, yet accuse no one until the logic is airtight. However, a more immediate candidate for the gallows has presented himself, or rather, Lestrade has presented him to me via a frantic telegram." He handed me a slip of paper. It read, "Prospective arrest imminent. Subject identified as Arthur Molyneux. Maritime connections established. Possesses key to the enclosure. Meet at Belfort House at 10. By 10 o'clock, we were ushered into the opulent, stiflingly grand drawing-room of Lord Belfort's townhouse. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. Lord Belfort himself stood by the window, a tall, skeletal figure with eyes like polished flint. Beside him stood Lestrade, looking uncharacteristically smug. "We have him, Holmes," the inspector announced, gesturing toward a man seated on a low divan. The suspect, Arthur Molyneux, was a man of perhaps 35, with the weathered skin and steady eyes of a sailor. He was dressed in a well-worn pilot's coat, and his hands, which gripped his knees, were calloused and stained with tar. "Mr. Molyneux was a school friend of the deceased," Lestrade explained, pacing the rug. But the friendship soured. "It appears Philip Stanhope owed Molyneux a staggering sum of money debts incurred during a disastrous joint venture in West African rubber. Furthermore, we have a witness to the square's night watchman who saw a man fitting Molyneux's description lurking near the south gate an hour before the murder." "And the key?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. Lestrade produced a small silver garden key from his pocket. "Found in the pocket of Mr. Molyneux's greatcoat when we apprehended him at his lodgings in Wapping. He claims it was sent to him anonymously by post 3 days ago." "A likely story." Molyneux looked up, his voice raspy but firm. "It is the truth, Inspector. I came to the square hoping to meet Philip. He had sent me a note saying he would settle the debt in the garden at midnight. But when I arrived and saw the police, I fled. I knew how it would look." "And the lantern?" Holmes inquired, stepping closer to Molyneux. "I presume you, as a man of the sea, are familiar with the nautical lantern found beside the body." "I've seen 1,000 like it, sir," Molyneux replied, "but I did not bring one to Berkeley Square. I had no need of a light. I know the square well." Holmes circled the man, his eyes darting over every inch of his attire. He paused, leaning down to inspect a small, dark stain on the hem of Molyneux's coat. He then straightened, a curious expression flitting across his face. "A very tidy case, Lestrade," Holmes said, his tone dripping with a sarcasm that only I seemed to catch. "The motive is classic, financial ruin and betrayal. The opportunity is documented, a witness and a key. And the signature of the crime, the maritime lantern, matches the suspect's profession with the precision of a mathematical formula." "Exactly," Lestrade cried. "It's an open and shut case." "It is, perhaps, a little too open," Holmes mused. He turned to Lord Belfort. "Tell me, your lordship, did your nephew have any other enemies? Anyone, perhaps, who might benefit from his death as much as Mr. Molyneux, but who possesses a more delicate touch?" Lord Belfort stiffened. "My nephew was a difficult man, Mr. Holmes. He had many disagreements. But I fail to see the relevance. The inspector has found the culprit." Holmes walked toward the door, beckoning me to follow. "The inspector has found a man who fits the frame, Watson. But a frame is not a picture. Did you notice Molyneux's hands?" "They were calloused, as you would expect of a sailor," I replied as we stepped back out into the cold. "Precisely. They are the hands of a man who works with rope and canvas. And yet, the silk thread I found on the lantern handle yesterday was of such a fine, surgical quality that it would have snapped instantly in hands as rough as his. No, Watson, we are being invited to look at Mr. Molyneux. And when Sherlock Holmes is invited to look in one direction, he finds it most profitable to look in the opposite." He paused, looking back at the Belfort mansion. "There is a shadow in that house, Watson. A shadow that moves with the same silent, gliding grace as our ghostly lantern. We must return to the garden, but this time we shall look not at the ground, but at the sky." Chapter 5. The silent geometry of the air, the arrest of Arthur Molyneux, had brought a sense of closure to the official investigation, but for Sherlock Holmes, the case was only beginning to crystallize. While Inspector Lestrade was busy drafting his reports and basking in the praise of the morning dailies, Holmes remained in a state of high-strung, restless agitation. He spent the better part of the afternoon pinned to his chair, surrounded by a fog of his own making, thick, grey wreaths of tobacco smoke that obscured the maps of London he had pinned to the wall. "You seem remarkably unconvinced by the inspector's success, Holmes," I remarked, attempting to clear the air by opening a window. The cold afternoon air rushed in, chilling the room instantly. "Success, Watson, is a relative term," Holmes replied, his voice coming like a sharp crack from the gloom. "Lestrade has found a man who had a motive and a key. He has ignored the fact that the physics of the crime are entirely beyond the capabilities of a common sailor. A maritime lantern does not glide through rhododendrons without snapping a single leaf, nor does it deposit a thread of surgical silk upon its handle. No, there is a missing dimension here, a vertical one." He sprang from his chair, his eyes gleaming with a sudden frantic intensity. "We must return to Berkeley Square. I have been looking at the ground, Watson, like a common bloodhound, when I should have been looking at the geometry of the air. The square was deserted when we arrived, the winter sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the frost-covered lawn. Holmes did not head for the sundial this time. Instead, he stood at the south gate and looked up toward the towering facade of the Belfort mansion. His gaze traced a line from the library balcony where Silas Vane had stood down to the central lawn. Vane said the light glided. Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. It moved with a sickening uniformity. That implies a fixed path, Watson, a path that ignores the obstacles of the terrain. He strode to the sundial and began to examine the gnomon, the triangular blade that casts the shadow. I watched as he took a small magnifying glass and peered at the very tip of the bronze metal. Aha! The cry was small, but filled with a fierce satisfaction. "What is it?" I asked, leaning in. "A scratch, Watson. A minute. Horizontal abrasion on the bronze, no wider than a hair. And look at the angle." He pointed his finger toward the library balcony of the house, nearly 50 yards away. "The 2 points are perfectly aligned." He then did something most peculiar. He began to pace the distance between the sundial and the rhododendron thicket, counting his steps with rhythmic precision. He stopped at the very center of the bushes and reached upward into the empty air. His fingers moved, as if he were plucking an invisible harp. "The silk thread," he whispered. "It wasn't a lead, Watson. It was the delivery system." He turned back to the house, his face a mask of cold calculation. "Tell me, Watson, do you recall the smell in the gardener's shed?" I asked Lestrade if he smelled scorched ozone. "I remember. He thought you were jesting." "It wasn't ozone from a storm," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "It was the smell of friction, high-speed friction. If one were to run a high tensile line from that balcony to this sundial, and then attach a weighted lantern via a specialized pulley, a pulley made of polished bone or vulcanized rubber, the lantern would indeed glide. It would move silently. It would pass over the bushes without touching them if the tension were high enough. And in the fog, the line itself would be utterly invisible." "But the footprints, Holmes," I protested. "Philip Stanhope's footprints led to the dial. He wasn't killed by a sliding lantern, he was frightened to death." Holmes' expression shifted, a shadow of something like grim admiration crossing his features. "Exactly." He was lured to the center of the lawn. He saw a light coming for him, a light that moved with an unearthly, spectral smoothness. He thought he was seeing a ghost, a family curse manifest in the mist. He died of a sudden, catastrophic heart failure brought on by sheer terror. He paused, his hand resting on the cold stone of the sundial. "But here is the secret clue, Watson. The one I shall not yet share with Lestrade." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, round object he must have retrieved from the grass near the sundial when I wasn't looking. It was a small, leaden weight, shaped like a teardrop, with a tiny, microscopic hook at its apex. "This was the anchor," Holmes said. "But look at the hook. It hasn't been bent by force. It has been melted." "Melted? But how?" "By a localized application of heat," Holmes replied, his eyes darting toward the Belfort house again. "A thermal trigger. Someone didn't just set a trap, they controlled it from a distance. And they did so with a degree of scientific precision that is quite outside the scope of a disgruntled sailor or a simple private secretary." He began to walk toward the house, his pace erratic, his mind clearly racing through a dozen different permutations of the truth. "The stakes have risen, Watson. We are not looking for a murderer who uses a knife or a gun. We are looking for a murderer who uses physics as a weapon. And if I am correct, the second act of this tragedy is already being prepared. But who, Holmes? Who has the knowledge?" "The one person we haven't truly scrutinized," Holmes said, his voice a sharp whisper as we approached the heavy oak doors of the mansion. "The one who stands to lose the most if the Norfolk estates are not sold. We must find the architect of the mechanism, Watson. And we must do it before the fog returns." Chapter 6. The erratic alchemy of Baker Street, the 48 hours following our return from Berkeley Square, were among the most trying I have ever endured in the company of Sherlock Holmes. He had descended into a state of what I can only describe as scientific mania. The sitting room at Baker Street, already a chaotic repository of books and chemicals, was transformed into a veritable laboratory of the macabre. Holmes had constructed a crude facsimile of the Belfort sundial using a heavy music stand, and a series of silk threads stretched across the room to the curtain rods. He spent hours running a small brass weight back and forth along these lines, measuring the friction with a stopwatch and muttering to himself in a language of pure mathematics. "The velocity is the key, Watson," he would cry, his eyes bloodshot and his hair a wild thicket. "If the descent is too slow, the illusion of gliding is lost. If too fast, the silk snaps. And the trigger, the beautiful, lethal trigger." He was currently hunched over a galvanic battery, his long, thin fingers trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. He was attempting to pass a current through a microscopic wire wrapped around a leaden hook. "You must rest, Holmes," I pleaded, stepping over a heap of geological maps of Norfolk. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and your nerves are frayed to the snapping point. Nerves are a luxury for those who do not have a murderer to catch, Watson. Tell me, what did the Morning Post bring? Did the shipping agent respond to my inquiry regarding the SS Cassandra?" "He did," I said, handing him a telegram. "The vessel arrived in London docks 3 weeks ago from the Mediterranean. One of the passengers, a Mr. Julian Vanebrother to the private secretary, was listed as a mechanical engineer of noted repute. Holmes didn't even look at the paper. He simply nodded, a sharp, bird-like movement. Julian, the missing piece. The engineer brother who vanished from his London lodgings the day before Philip Stanhope died. But why the geological surveys? Why break into the library last night only to steal maps of a marshy estate in Norfolk? I was about to answer when the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson on the stairs preceded a frantic knocking. Before she could even announce the visitor, the door was flung open by Silas Vane. If he had looked pale before, he now looked like a man who had seen the gates of hell itself. "Mr. Holmes, it has happened again," he gasped, clutching the doorframe. The light, it appeared in the grand hallway of the mansion not an hour ago. Lord Belfort, he saw it. He was coming down the stairs when a glow manifested at the top of the gallery. It glided down the banister, trailing that same wretched scent of scorched metal. His lordship has suffered a stroke from the shock. The doctors say he may not last the night. Holmes stood up with a suddenness that sent his music-stand sundial crashing to the floor. "And the lantern, Mr. Vane? Was the maritime lantern found this time?" "No, sir. This time there was nothing. Only a faint, shimmering residue on the mahogany of the railing. Like snail's silk, but hot to the touch." Holmes' behavior suddenly shifted from manic focus to a cold, frighteningly calm resolve. He began to strip off his dressing gown and reach for his boots. "The second act," Holmes whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. "The architect is refining his method. He no longer needs the heavy lantern to terrify. He has moved from the physical to the chemical. He is using a phosphorus-based gel, Watson, delivered via the same silk wire system, but this time integrated into the architecture of the house itself." He turned to Vane, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Mr. Vane, who has had access to the house's internal telegraph wires and the new electric lighting system installed last year?" Vane blinked, confused. "Why?" "My brother Julian assisted the engineers. He is a genius with such things. But Julian is missing. We fear he has been kidnapped by the same forces. Julian is not missing, Mr. Vane. He is hiding in plain sight," Holmes snapped. He grabbed his deerstalker and his heavy walking stick. "Watson, we have no time for the authorities. Lestrade is still at the yard, probably polishing the handcuffs he put on Molyneux. We must go to the Holborn district to the workshop of a certain Mr. Elias Thorne, a maker of precision instruments for the Admiralty." "Why Thorne?" I asked, struggling to keep up as Holmes bounded down the stairs. "Because Thorne is the only man in London who sells the specialized surgical-grade silk thread I found in the garden. And according to my ledgers, he made a bulk sale last month to a man with a distinctive scar on his thumb, a scar I noticed on the hand of a certain distraught secretary as he leaned against my chair 2 days ago." I froze on the landing. Silas Vane. But he was the one who came to us. He saw the ghost. He provided the narrative, Watson. He was the witness who ensured we believed in the supernatural. He and his brother are a team, one providing the mechanical miracles, the other providing the terror. They don't just want the inheritance, they want the land. And I suspect the geological surveys they stole will tell us that the Norfolk marshlands are, sitting atop a vein of high-grade anthracite coal that would make them richer than the crown. As we leaped into a waiting hansom, the fog began to curl around us once more. Holmes sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the misty distance. The erratic energy was gone, replaced by the deadly singular focus of a hunter who finally has the scent. "To Holborn, driver," Holmes shouted. "And drive as if the devil himself were behind you, for tonight we meet the ghost maker in his own lair." Chapter 7. The master of the invisible wire, the workshop of Elias Thorne, was a cramped, labyrinthine sanctuary of brass and glass, tucked away in a soot-blackened court off Holborn. It was a place where time seemed to be measured not in hours, but in the precise oscillations of chronometer springs. When we arrived, the shop was shuttered, but a judicious application of Holmes' skeleton keys soon saw us inside the smelling salts and oil-scented interior. "Efficiency, Watson, is the hallmark of the criminal mind when it is wedded to science," Holmes remarked, his lantern beam sweeping across a workbench. He ignored the rows of sextants and focused on a ledger resting near a heavy spool of what looked like shimmering cobwebs. He leafed through the pages with a predatory speed. "Here, SV-12 hanks of triple-braid surgical silk, 2 bespoke micropulleys with graphite bearings. The purchase was made a month ago. And look at this. He pointed to a discarded scrap of paper in the bin. It was a sketcher diagram of a tension ratchet, designed to be mounted onto a standard curtain rod or a balcony rail. The brothers have been meticulous, I noted, a chill running down my spine. But how do we catch them? They are already inside the Belfort house, and Lord Belfort is at death's door. We shall catch them, Watson, by inviting them to complete their masterpiece, Holmes said, a sardonic light dancing in his eyes. But we shall provide a different ending than the one they have scripted. By midnight, we had returned to the gloom of Berkeley Square. The fog had thickened into a viscous, white shroud, rendering the world a place of ghosts and muffled echoes. However, Holmes was no longer the detached observer. He had spent the last hour in the back of our hansom, transforming his appearance with the deftness of a stage magician. When he stepped out, he was no longer the lean detective. He was a stooped, elderly man in the uniform of a square night watchman, his face obscured by a thick muffler and a low-slung cap. Even I, standing 3 feet from him, struggled to recognize the sharp features of my friend beneath the layers of carefully applied grease paint and the sagging posture of age. "You, Watson, must take your position in the shrubbery near the sundial," he whispered, his voice now a raspy, aged croak. "The brothers believe the game is nearly won. With Lord Belfort incapacitated, they need one final manifestation to ensure Silas is seen as the hero who tried to save him, while Julian discovers the coal-rich surveys in the confusion. They will attempt to trigger the mechanism from the library balcony once more. And what will you do?" "I shall be the grit in their gears," he replied, handing me a small, heavy pair of wire cutters. "Wait for my signal, low whistle. When you hear it, do not move. But when you see the light, count to 3, then strike at the base of the sundial." I watched as the watchman hobbled toward the servants' entrance of the Belfort mansion, swinging a heavy, unlit lantern. I retreated into the damp, freezing embrace of the rhododendrons. The silence of the square was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic tolling of a church bell. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, a movement caught my eye. High above, on the library balcony, 2 shadows appeared. They moved with a synchronized, mechanical efficiency. I saw the faint glint of metal ratchet being tightened. They were preparing the line. Suddenly, a low melodic whistle drifted through the fog. Almost immediately, a point of light ignited at the balcony's edge. It was not the steady flame of a candle, but a shimmering, cold, blue-green radiance phosphorus gel Holmes had predicted. It began its descent, gliding with that same sickening, silent uniformity toward the center of the lawn. I held my breath, my fingers tensing around the wire cutters. But as the light reached the halfway point, something went wrong. The watchman below had stepped directly into its path. He raised his own lantern, and with a sudden, violent movement, he swung it upward. There was a sharp, metallic ping, the sound of a high-tension wire snapping under sudden stress. The blue light didn't just stop it, whipped backward with terrific force. A cry of pure, unadulterated terror erupted from the balcony. In the silence that followed, I heard the heavy thud of a body hitting the stone tiles above, followed by the frantic shouting of Silas Vane. "Julian, the line! The line has fouled. It is not the line that has fouled, Mr. Vane." A voice rang out, not the raspy croak of a watchman, but the clear, ringing tones of Sherlock Holmes. He had cast off his cap and stood illuminated by the very light the brothers had created. "It is your logic. Your ghost has been exorcised." I scrambled from the bushes as Holmes sprinted toward the house. The trap had been sprung, and the spectral engineer had been caught in his own invisible web. Chapter 8. The architect of the apparition, the library of the Belfort mansion, was a scene of clinical devastation. The heavy velvet curtains had been torn back, and the French windows to the balcony stood wide to the swirling yellow fog. Julian Vane, the missing brother, was no longer a phantom. He was a very corporeal man in a soot-stained waistcoat, his hand pinned against the stone balustrade by the jagged remnants of a shattered brass spool. Beside him, Silas Vane had collapsed into a leather armchair, his face the color of wood ash, staring at Holmes as if the detective himself were the spectre. Inspector Lestrade, whom Holmes had apparently alerted by a prearranged signal to a nearby patrol, burst into the room with 2 constables. He looked from the tangled wires to the wounded engineer, his mouth agape. "Holmes, what in the name of the Crown is this?" Lestrade demanded. "I have a man in the cells at Wapping, and here you are at the crime scene with— Is that a telegraph wire?" "Not a telegraph wire, Lestrade," Holmes said, stepping into the golden light of the library's chandelier and casually dusting off his watchman's coat. "It is the umbilical cord of a very clever murder. You may release Mr. Molyneux. His only crime was being a convenient scapegoat for a man who understood the tension strength of silk better than the weight of a guilty conscience." Holmes walked to the balcony and retrieved a small, blackened object from Julian's bleeding hand. It was the micro-pulley we had seen sketched in Holborn. "You see, Lestrade," Holmes began, his voice taking on that lecture hall tone he adopted when a case was won, "the mystery of the Belfort enclosure was never one of spirits, but of physics. The ghost was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. A high tensile line of surgical silk was stretched from this very balcony to the sundial in the garden. In the fog, such a thread is utterly invisible. A weighted lantern, suspended by this graphite-bearing pulley, was released from above. It did not glide by magic, it slid down the incline of the wire under the force of gravity. But the bushes," Vane croaked, his voice trembling. "It went through the bushes." "It went over them, Mr. Vane," Holmes corrected sharply. "The tension was so great that the wire remained taut, carrying the light inches above the foliage. Philip Stanhope was lured to the centre of the lawn by the sight of this bobbing light. He was a man of high nerves and superstitious dread. When the light charged him with silent, inhuman speed, his heart simply failed. To ensure no trace of the mechanism remained, Julian used a galvanic battery, the same one used for your new electric bell, to send a surge of heat through a microscopic wire wrapped around the leaden hook. The hook melted, the lantern dropped to the grass, and the silk thread, released from its anchor, snapped back to this balcony like a whip. Total elapsed time for the clean-up, 3 seconds. Lestrade peered at the spool. "And the second attack on Lord Belfort, a refinement," Holmes said, pacing the rug. No lantern was needed. A simple coating of phosphorus gel on the wire, triggered by friction. It created a shimmering path that appeared to move down the stairs. It was meant to be the final blow to Lord Belfort's fragile health, leaving the estate in the hands of a man who could be easily manipulated. Holmes turned to the desk, picking up a heavy roll of parchment, the geological surveys. "And here is the why to the how. These are not just maps of the Norfolk marshes. They are surveys conducted by Julian Vane during his time in the Mediterranean, using advanced boring techniques. They reveal a massive vein of anthracite coal beneath the Belfort land. Philip Stanhope knew the land was valuable for its beauty and refused to sell. But the Vane brothers knew it was worth a fortune in mineral rights. With the heir dead and the lord incapacitated, Silas, as private secretary, would have been the one to oversee the liquidation of the worthless marshland straight into a shell company owned by his brother. Julian Vane made a sudden, desperate lunge for a letter opener on the desk, but I was faster. I caught his wrist and, with a sharp twist, forced him back into the grasp of the constables. "A most ingenious plan, Mr. Vane," Holmes said, looking down at the broken engineer with a cold, analytical detachment. "You almost succeeded in making the laws of nature work against themselves. But you forgot one thing. Nature leaves a footprint, even when it travels on a silk thread. That single strand of grey silk thigh found on the lantern was your signature. And like all signatures, it eventually led me back to the hand that held the pen." As Lestrade led the brothers away, Silas Vane turned back, his eyes hollow. "How did you know it was tonight, Holmes? How did you know we would strike again?" "Because, sir," Holmes replied, lighting his pipe with a steady hand, "the fog was perfect. And a man with your specific brand of genius can never resist the urge to see his own ghost walk one last time." Chapter 9. The residue of the supernatural. By the following evening, the great yellow shroud that had stifled London finally began to tear. A sharp wind from the east swept the soot-laden vapours toward the Channel, revealing a sky of cold, piercing stars. At 221B Baker Street, The fire in our sitting room burned with a cheerful defiance against the winter chill, and the air was finally free of the chemical odors that had dominated our quarters during Holmes' frantic investigation. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long legs stretched toward the hearth, a volume of medieval music resting unread upon his lap. He appeared remarkably rejuvenated. The manic, erratic energy of the past few days had subsided into a quiet, contemplative satisfaction. The case of the lantern in the fog was officially closed, at least as far as the public record was concerned. The door opened to admit a much transformed Arthur Molyneux. No longer the bedraggled suspect in the pilot's coat, he was dressed with the quiet dignity of a man whose honor had been restored. He stood for a moment in the doorway, his eyes traveling from Holmes to myself, before he stepped forward and offered a calloused hand to my friend. "I am told, Mr. Holmes, that I owe my life to a silk thread, and your refusal to believe in ghosts," Molyneux said, his voice steady. "Inspector Lestrade came to the cells himself this morning. He was less than forthcoming with the details, but he made it clear that the Vane brothers would be taking my place in the dock. The inspector has a talent for brevity when it serves the reputation of the yard," Holmes replied with a faint smile, shaking the man's hand. "But you owe me nothing, Mr. Molyneux. You were a victim of a very modern form of alchemy, one that attempts to transmute a man's reputation into a scaffold. I trust Lord Belfort has been informed of your innocence." "He has, sir." "And more. In his recovery, his lordship has seen fit to honour the debt Philip owed me. He has realised that the spirited debates his nephew held were fuelled by a genuine love for the family's heritage, a heritage the Vanes would have stripped for coal. It is a bitter comfort, but a comfort nonetheless." Once Molyneux had departed, promising to return to his ship within the week, I turned to Holmes. "It is a harrowing thought, Holmes," I remarked, stoking the fire, "that a man's own imagination can be turned into a lethal weapon. Philip Stanhope was not struck by a blade or poisoned by a draught. He was killed by the projection of his own fears." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The Vane brothers were students of human frailty. They knew that in the fog, the line between the rational and the irrational becomes blurred. They didn't need a ghost, they only needed the idea of one. The human heart is a delicate mechanism, Watson. It beats with the rhythm of our blood, but it is governed by the shadows of our minds. When Julian Vane propelled that light towards Stanhope, he wasn't just moving a lantern, he was accelerating a crisis of the soul. "And what of the brothers?" I asked. Lestrade seemed confident of a conviction. "The evidence is overwhelming," Holmes replied. "The silk thread, the micropulleys, and the geological surveys found in Julian's possession form a chain of logic that even the most imaginative barrister could not break. Moreover, the residue found on the banister in the house has been analyzed. It was indeed a phosphoric compound, identical to the chemicals found in Julian's Holborn workshop. They will likely face the assizes by spring." I leaned back, my mind drifting back to the silent, gliding light in the garden. "You know, Holmes, for a moment, even I was tempted to believe. When that light passed through the rhododendrons without a sound, it felt as though the laws of our world had simply dissolved." Holmes chuckled, a dry, rhythmic sound. "The laws of nature never dissolve, Watson. They only become more complex as our understanding of them grows. A century ago, a telegram would have been seen as witchcraft. Today, it is a commonplace of the post office. The Vanes simply utilized the technology of tomorrow to simulate the superstitions of yesterday." He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the clear London night. The gas lamps now shone with a crisp, steady light, no longer muffled by the pea-souper. "The tragedy of the matter," he added quietly, "is that Julian Vane had a genuine spark of genius. Had he applied his knowledge of friction and tension to the advancement of industry rather than the pursuit of greed, he might have been remembered as a pioneer. Instead, he will be remembered as a man who tried to hang a ghost on a wire." I looked at my notes, the beginning of a new chronicle already forming in my mind. It was a story of shadows and science, of a fog that hid a murder and a mind that pierced the gloom. But as I watched Holmes, I realized that for him, the case was already a relic of the past. He was already searching the horizon for the next challenge, the next puzzle that would demand the full measure of his extraordinary logic. Chapter 10. The philosophy of the loom. A week had passed since the arrest of the Vane brothers, and the great case of the Berkeley Square ghost had already begun to recede into the annals of Scotland Yard's more eccentric successes. The London air remained crisp and clear, the winter sun occasionally piercing the grey canopy to glint off the brass fittings of the hansoms that rattled past our windows. Inside 221B, the debris of the investigation, the silk threads, the chemical batteries, and the geological charts had been cleared away by a weary but efficient Mrs. Hudson. Holmes had returned to his violin, and for the last hour, the mournful, intricate strains of a Mendelssohn concerto had been the only sound in our sitting room. I sat at my desk, putting the finishing touches on the manuscript that would eventually become this chronicle. "You are giving it too much colour, Watson," Holmes remarked, without pausing in his playing. He was standing by the window, his back to me, the bow moving with effortless grace. "I can hear the scratch of your pen whenever you reach a particularly atmospheric passage. You have undoubtedly spent the last 5 minutes describing the fog as if it were a sentient beast." I smiled, setting down my pen. "It felt sentient at the time, Holmes. And you must admit, the image of a gliding spectral light is far more compelling than a lecture on the friction coefficients of graphite-lubricated pulleys." Holmes turned, resting his violin on the sideboard. His expression was one of mild, detached amusement. "That is the tragedy of the chronicler, my dear fellow. You must provide the lace and the velvet, while I am content with the bare bones of the loom. You see a ghost, I see a vector. You see a miracle, I see a misapplication of the laws of motion. And yet, I countered, you were the one who dressed as a night watchman to intercept that vector. There was a certain theatricality in your own approach." "A necessary concession to the psychology of the culprits," he replied, taking his pipe from the mantelpiece. "To catch a man who plays upon the imagination, one must occasionally enter the theatre himself. But let us not mistake the stagecraft for the science. The Vanes were undone not by my disguise, but by their own over-reliance on a single invisible variable. They assumed that because the wire was unseen, it was non-existent. It is a common error of the criminal mind to believe that what is hidden is also erased." A sharp knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and Billy, our page, entered with a silver tray bearing a single heavy envelope embossed with the Belfort crest. Holmes opened it, glancing over the contents before tossing it onto the table. A note of gratitude from Lord Belfort. He is making a full recovery and has decided to establish a scholarship for mechanical engineering in his nephew's name. A touch of irony, perhaps, given the source of Philip's demise, but a noble sentiment nonetheless. "And the coal?" I asked. "The Norfolk estates will remain as they are," Holmes said, his voice softening slightly. "His lordship has decided that some treasures are better left beneath the earth than brought to the surface at the cost of blood and deception. The Vane brothers have succeeded only in ensuring that the land they coveted will now be protected by a triple-locked trust." He walked over to the fire, staring into the embers. "It is a strange thing, Watson. We live in an age of unprecedented enlightenment. We have harnessed the lightning and bridged the oceans with steam. And yet, the moment the fog rolls in and a light moves where it should not, the Victorian gentleman reverts to the terrified tribesman of the Neolithic. Our progress is a very thin veneer over a very deep well of ancient shadows. Perhaps that is why your work is so vital," I suggested. "You are the one who holds the lantern against those shadows." Holmes laughed, a rare, genuine sound of mirth. "If I hold a lantern, Watson, it is only to see the mechanical workings of the world more clearly. I am no crusader against the dark, I am merely a man who dislikes a messy equation." He turned away from the fire, his eyes suddenly sharpening as they fell upon a small, crumpled telegram that had arrived earlier that afternoon, which he had hitherto ignored. He picked it up, his long fingers smoothed the paper, and a familiar light began to kindle in his gaze. "Tell me, Watson," he said, his voice crackling with a new energy. "Are you familiar with the case of the red-haired cobbler of Southwark? It appears a man has vanished from a locked cellar, leaving behind only a pair of perfectly polished boots and a half-eaten orange. The yard is baffled, and Lestrade is already scratching his head until I fear for his scalp. I sighed, reaching for my tote and my medical bag. The quiet of the evening was over, and the philosophy of the past case was already being pushed aside by the urgency of the next. "I assume we are going to Southwark?" I asked. "The air is clear, the cab is waiting, and a half-eaten orange is a most inviting piece of data," Holmes cried, his coat swirling around him as he headed for the door. "Come, Watson!" The game is afoot, and the world, thank heaven, is still full of puzzles that defy the ordinary. As we descended the stairs into the bustling life of Baker Street, I looked back at our sitting room one last time. The shadows were there, as they always would be, but as long as Sherlock Holmes walked the streets of London, I knew that the light of reason would never truly be extinguished. Chapter 11. The echoes in the Old Bailey, the transition from the shadowed, foggy enclosures of Berkeley Square to the sterile, oppressive dignity of the Old Bailey was a transition from the world of Gothic nightmare to the cold reality of British jurisprudence. The trial of Julian and Silas Vane became, almost overnight, a public obsession. The ghost-makers of Mayfair, as the sensationalist press had dubbed them, occupied the imagination of a London that was increasingly fascinated by the intersection of science and sin. I sat in the gallery on the third day of the proceedings, watching as the machinery of the law prepared to grind the Vane brothers into the dust of history. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the faint, sweet aroma of the judge's snuff. Below us, in the dock, the two brothers presented a striking contrast. Silas Vane was a shattered man, his head bowed, his fingers twitching rhythmically, as if he were still trying to tighten an invisible wire. Julian, however, remained defiant. He sat with his back straight, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, wearing the arrogant sneer of a misunderstood genius whose masterpiece had been crudely interrupted. The centerpiece of the prosecution's evidence was a large wooden frame constructed by the police under Holmes' meticulous direction. It stood in the well of the court like a gallows. Across it, a single strand of that fateful surgical silk had been stretched, shimmering under the gaslights. Beside it sat the maritime lantern and the micropulse, those tiny graphite-bearing instruments of death. "It is not the man we are trying, but the mechanism," Holmes had whispered to me that morning as we entered the building. And indeed, the trial felt more like a lecture on physics than a criminal proceeding. The High Prosecutor called Sherlock Holmes to the stand in the afternoon. My friend stepped into the witness box with his usual air of bored superiority, as if the life and death stakes of the trial were merely a trivial exercise in logic. He described the lantern in the fog with a clinical precision that chilled the gallery. When he reached the point in his testimony regarding the thermal trigger, the microscopic wire that melted the hook to erase the Crimea collective gasp rose from the spectators. "You speak of these things, Mr. Holmes, as if they were common knowledge," the defense counsel sneered during cross-examination. "Is it not true that such a device is purely theoretical? Could not a gust of wind, a common London breeze, have carried a light across a garden?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "A breeze, sir, does not follow a straight line with a deviation of less than a millimetre over 50 yards. A breeze does not melt leaden hooks with galvanic precision. And a breeze, most importantly, does not purchase surgical silk from a specialized instrument maker in Holborn while wearing a signet ring belonging to the House of Belfort." The defense counsel sat down, his face a sudden mask of defeat. The most harrowing moment of the trial, however, came when Julian Vane was permitted to speak. He did not deny the act. Instead, he championed it. "You call it murder," he cried, his voice ringing through the otter-panelled room. "I call it a proof of concept. That land in Norfolk, that wasteland of peat and marsh, sits upon the fuel that will power the next century. Philip Stanhope was a relic, a man who preferred the sight of a sunset to the heat of a furnace. I used his own superstitions to remove an obstacle to progress. If the heart of a fool cannot withstand the sight of the future, is that the fault of the engineer?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the most hardened criminals in the gallery seemed cowed by the cold, industrial soul of the man in the dock. It was the ultimate expression of the danger Holmes had warned me about, the intellect divorced from morality, the loom working without a conscience. The jury took less than an hour to return a verdict of guilty on all counts. As the judge donned the black cap, Silas Vane collapsed into the arms of the wardens, but Julian remained standing, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Holmes. He did not look at him with hatred, but with a terrifying sort of kinship, as if they were the only two men in the room who truly understood the beauty of the invisible wire. As we walked away from the Old Bailey, the winter sun was setting, casting a bloody light over the dome of St. Paul's. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. He walked with his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his chin tucked into his muffler. "You are thinking of Julian Vane?" I asked, as we hailed a hansom. "I am thinking of the next one, Watson," he replied. "The veins are a symptom, not the disease. As science provides us with more delicate tools, the shadows they cast will only grow longer. Today, it was a silk thread and a lantern. Tomorrow? Who can say what invisible forces will be harnessed by the greedy and the desperate?" We returned to Baker Street in a mood of somber reflection. The case was ended, the culprits were condemned, and the ghost was laid to rest. But as I watched Holmes return to his maps and his monographs, I realized that the echoes of that trial would haunt my dreams for a long time to come. The world was changing, and the darkness was changing with it. Chapter 12. The final strand of the cobweb, the spring of 1896, arrived with a sudden, fragrant breath of life that seemed to banish the lingering soot of the previous winter's tragedies. The case of the lantern in the fog had passed from the headlines into the leather-bound volumes of my own private records, yet its impact remained visible in the small changes of our daily lives. Lord Belfort, transformed by the brush with the supernatural and the subsequent revelation of human treachery, had become a frequent correspondent. His letters no longer spoke of estate liquidations or aristocratic squabbles, but of the thriving bird sanctuary he had established on the Norfolk Marshes place, where the only flights were those of the marsh harriers and the grey herons. It was on a particularly bright Tuesday in April that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves at a small, sun-drenched table in a cafe near the British Museum. Holmes had spent the morning immersed in the study of early Chaldean inscriptions, a pursuit he claimed was the only suitable palate cleanser after the greasy industrialism of the Vane trial. "You look remarkably at peace, Watson," he remarked, eyeing my third scone with a look of clinical interest. "Is it the weather, or have you finally finished your account of our nautical physics murder?" "I have," I replied, patting the pocket of my coat where the manuscript lay, though I still wonder if the public will believe it. A murder committed by gravity and silk is a difficult pill for the average reader to swallow. The truth is rarely palatable. "Watson, it is merely necessary," Holmes said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette. "The Vane brothers are, at this moment, reflecting on the gravity of their situation within the walls of Newgate. Julian continues to send me letters, you know. He wishes to discuss the potential for using pressurized air in the delivery of long-range projectiles. I have, of course, declined to respond. One does not provide the wolf with better teeth." He reached into his waistcoat and produced a small silver object. It was the micro-pulley, the same one that had glided through the Berkeley Square fog. It had been returned to him by the court as a scientific curiosity. He held it up to the sunlight, the graphite bearings spinning with a silent, hypnotic fluidity. "This is the true ghost, Watson," he murmured. "A piece of perfectly calibrated machinery. In the right hands, it is a tool of progress. In the wrong hands, it is a weapon of terror. The tragedy of our age is that we are advancing our intellects far faster than we are advancing our morals. We are like children who have found a loaded revolver in the nursery." "And what of the lantern?" I asked. "I heard Lestrade had it placed in the Black Museum." "Indeed. It sits between a poisoned dart from the Andaman Islands and a set of counterfeiters' dies. A fitting resting place for a light that was used to create darkness. But enough of the past. The past is a fixed point, Watson, and my mind is always reaching for the variables of the future." He snapped the pulley into his palm and pocketed it with a sharp, decisive movement. "I noticed you were looking at the morning paper with some intensity before we left Baker Street. Did the red-haired cobbler provide any further amusement, or has the mystery of the half-eaten orange been solved by a hungry constable?" I laughed. "The cobbler has been found, Holmes. It appears he wasn't kidnapped at all. He had simply won a small fortune at the races and decided to take a spontaneous holiday to Brighton without informing his wife. The orange was his breakfast, the boots were his pride. Holmes sighed, a sound of profound disappointment, commonplace, utterly commonplace. The world is becoming too transparent, Watson. We are in dire need of a villain with a bit of imagination, or at least a victim with a more interesting diet. As we rose to leave, a young boy in the uniform of a telegraph messenger came sprinting down the pavement, weaving through the pedestrians with practiced ease. He stopped before our table, panting, and handed Holmes a blue envelope. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir." Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the lines with a speed that always left me breathless. A slow, predatory smile began to spread across his hawkish features. He handed the telegram to me. It read, "Urgent. The crown jewels of the Duke of Argyll have been replaced by perfect copies made of solidified sugar. The Duke is distraught. The scene is a sealed vault. Please advise. Lestrade." "Solidified sugar," Holmes whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden infectious delight. The chemistry of the confectioner wedded to the daring of the thief. Now that, Watson, is a puzzle worthy of a spring afternoon. Tell me, do you have your service revolver? The Duke's vault is famously deep, and I suspect our sweet criminal may have a sour disposition when cornered. I felt the old thrill of the chase surge through my veins. The shadows of Berkeley Square were gone, replaced by the glittering, crystalline challenge of a new mystery. "I have it, Holmes," I said, hailing a passing hansom. "Then to Argyll House, Watson. The game is afoot once more, and thank God. It appears the world still has a few tricks left up its sleeve that cannot be explained by a simple holiday in Brighton." As the hansom lurched forward into the bustling heart of London, I looked at my friend. He was leaning forward, his eyes bright, his mind already dissecting the molecular structure of the Duke's missing diamonds. The fog had lifted, the ghosts were gone, and Sherlock Holmes was exactly where he was meant to be in pursuit of the impossible.